All right. Cam, what is your topic?
Will genetically altered animals be beneficial to humankind?
It's a long topic.
I usually just paraphrase it as GMO animals good.
Yeah, I said, will genetically altered animals benefit us? All right. Audience, are you ready?
Yes. Yeah.
Nope. Cam, are you ready?
Yep.
And proceed.
When you hear the term GMO, you likely think of our agriculture industry since they are widely used there, such as our corn. We use GMOs to grow bigger corn, grow more corn, healthier corn, but we also use it in things like our meat industry, such as through cows and chickens. We'll give them GMOs to increase the quality of the meat or products that we get from them, and just the general overall to benefit what we get out of those products. But we actually use it for a lot more than that are highly beneficial. And that's why I'm going to be telling you why animal-based GMOs are beneficial and some plant ones, and how they'll have a big impact in our future. I'll be going over some current uses, benefits, and also some future uses of how we're going to be handling GMOs. But first, what is a GMO? According to psu.edu, genetic engineering is the deliberate modification of the animal's genome using the scientific tools of modern technology. By incorporating genes from one organism into another is a process called transgenesis. And we use these GMOs for many things, such as I stated earlier, increasing the yields of the products we get, giving these animals and plants resilience to disease and infections, as well as overall increasing the quality of what we get out of them. But there's also many uses that people do not think of for how we use these. Other applications include the production of non-protein bioplastic or non-industrial ornamental plant products, stated by nature.com. Another reason that we genetically modify from yourgenome.org, genetically engineered animals enable scientists to gain an insight into the basic biological processes and the relationships between mutations and diseases. So we don't only use these modifications in order to get products out of animals or plants, we also use them to study and learn more about how we're using it, about these animals and plants. And this kind of highlights just how big the overall umbrella of how we use GMOs currently actually is. And there's also many benefits, as I've already stated, higher yields, higher qualities, whatnot, as well as some things like you can make the GMO'd organism a bigger size, you can make it smaller, have a longer lifespan. A lot of different technicalities can go into it. But there's also a lot of possible benefits that we're currently working into now and actually beginning to develop commercially. The following developing benefits come from psu.edu: advancing human health, enhancing food production and quality, mitigating environmental impact, optimizing animal welfare, and improving industrial products. And some of those might sound familiar as they're not quite perfected yet, so we haven't pushed them commercially, but we are starting to learn more about these things and make them a more mainstream idea of using GMOs. And how do we want to use these in the future, since that's going to probably be a big impact coming up, since the world's going to keep growing, we're going to keep using resources, we need to find new substitutes for things. A big one is fuel. According to nature.com, a number of microorganisms are being considered as future clean fuel producers and biodegraders, which is pretty important since gas prices keep going up, we keep using gas, we don't really use much of coal anymore. So we're going to need to substitute it for something clean and renewable, and this could be a great option. We also plan on using more in vaccines, as well as making proteins and even transplants. According to nature.com, genetically modified animals have even been used to grow transplant tissues and human transplant organs, a concept called xenotransplantation. But overall, I feel like this kind of highlights how we currently use them as a benefit to our society, how these benefits affect us. And even though some people might seem kind of skeptical or critical overall about how we use GMOs, I see it as a very beneficial purpose that we use them for, and the future looks very bright for how we plan on using GMOs. And I think they will become a very big part of our future as we continue to evolve our society overall. Thank you.
Yeah.
407.16.
Closest we've ever been.
What is it?
407.23.
Oh,
Oh, that's a hundredth, seventh. How do you say it?
700.
Is that what it is?
Very small. It's less than a millisecond apart.
Dylan's next.
Well, I want to talk about for hours for everything in terms of time. One is your as long as it calms down, it's slow, it's fine for time, and then that's actually fine. So looking at my other one, I had to off the same reason, but that one for 6 minutes. So as long as I stay slow, I stay practical by a little quicker. Okay. Let's talk about it. Right. Plus, I could easily kind of close it all together. If I see I'm not 4, I see that I can quickly close it all.
Yeah. Don't disregard the conclusion along the way.
Yeah.
I've been giving it.
Gotta watch the time.
You're right.
I was trying to think of anything, but it was like, is the extent of homeless?
This just feels wrong.
Cool.
We stayed late. You go up and down. I've been doing this the whole time. You just.
I mean, each thing is applied in. I mean, not everyone notices or experiences the same way.
I don't know, like.
I think as a fact that if you
I twisted it.
statistical sense in this account, to be 5 they were look money that are homeless technically by statistics. But it's the same idea that you're not always going to notice it.
Right. I think
But like in urban areas, it's one big place.
Sure.
Large market.
right.
I think it's like.
All right. We'll start getting lined up for Dylan.
Oh, get out of here. That's mean. I could have. Your group is going Thursday. Everyone on Andy's group, are you okay with that?
All right, Dylan, what is your topic?
On the extent of homelessness and exaggerated.
Homelessness exaggerated.
Yeah, it is. They like the extent of it, like the way it's portrayed. I'll just restate because you're confused. Like that's what the first time says.
Save it for the speech.
Let's not harangue the speaker.
Sorry.
I just wanted to use the word harangue.
So like harass, but
Yeah. Yeah.
cool.
All right, audience, are you ready?
Yep.
Dylan, are you ready?
Mhm.
And proceed.
Homelessness, as we all know, it is defined as not having a home or a solid place to stay or rest your feet at night that can be considered yours. And that leads into the confusion and the clouded judgment of the extent of homelessness. And if you look and think about homelessness the way it is, you generally think of people living on the street. You don't really notice or pay attention to shelters or different issues like that. And you don't pay attention to the amount that there is or what these people previously had or the amount of things that aren't being done to help these people. So homelessness stays as it is, but it isn't always a noticeable thing depending on where you live and what you grow up with. Homelessness, and if you look at the amount of people, there are 553,742 people that are homeless in the United States. Now that number has gone up more with COVID and it shifts around a lot, but it's gone up more than it was like 10 years ago. And that means that'd be 17 and 10,000 people that are homeless. And if you look at our county specifically, if you were to take that statistic, the population reported by the 2020 census is 14,723 in Renville County. Now that means that 25 people theoretically would be homeless in Renville County, but that's not something you always see in these rural areas, as I'll focus on and talk about. And that means to it being unnoticeable is because in this area, we don't see it. So it's generally hidden about, and you generally see it in larger areas. You aren't going to see it centralized here. The hidden amounts, if you look at the percentages, it is bigger in larger cities and larger markets. USICH statistically shows that 2020 homeless population is 1.37% MN, but 27.89% California. That's over a quarter. So you know California is really bad for homelessness. That's what you see it there. But some areas are also up to 15% as well. So in these larger areas, these larger cities, it's more noticeable, which is where you get the clouded judgment of it because you don't see it around here. You don't see it in the small states, and shelters also cover for it. The National Alliance to End Homeless stated in 2017, the vast majority of homelessness population lived in some form of shelter or in transitional housing, 360,867 people at the time of the point in time count. So at that time, 360,000 of the 550,000 lived in a shelter, but they're still homeless. But you're going to see a giant less of a chunk that isn't there. And these concentrations are in larger cities. I've been to Minneapolis. I've seen homeless people there. You don't see it around here. It's not something that a lot of people see because of how widespread it is. Yeah, there's more people in larger cities, but the way it's widespread, you get all these different views, even in smaller amounts, that don't see it. So it's not shown about that what it truly is, which makes it generally ignored. And the problems we run into is these people, they were previously housed, but they're stuck with the way they are. So generally they find shelters, they find other means, and they don't have the funding to ultimately find something better, but they generally stay hidden. So you don't notice that, you don't see it, you're not used to it. And if you, for example, for funding that's done, $2.5 million house in Berkeley would give $62,500 for the homeless. So that depends on the areas, what they do. But in San Francisco, the same house would only give $18,750 of general funding. So there's less put into it, but in these specific areas, in these larger areas, depending on what people do, they put more to it, but it still isn't shown. It's only shown in these areas. It's not shown here. It's not shown more openly. And the main issue that also happens is one-way tickets. You're not going to always be noticing or constantly seeing a population if people are constantly moving around because people throw them out of their cities with one-way tickets. Now, it may give them housing in a different area, but they give how it works is free tickets are given to basically just tell people just kind of go out and go on their way. To just throw them out of the community. Generally, San Francisco is really known for that. They'll give homeless people one-way tickets, so they'll leave the area and become someone else's problem. But it generally gives them better opportunities, but they also have problems if they do stay there. If they leave that area that they're sent to that helps them, they're banned from it. They can't be helped there ever again, and the other place doesn't want it back. So they can really leave family and a lot of things behind. The Guardian 2017 states, cities have been offering homeless people free bus tickets to relocate elsewhere for at least 3 decades. So you're constantly shifting these people around, you're constantly changing your numbers, and people are throwing people in your city, and you're throwing people out. So it's making it really difficult. And that's where the extent of homelessness isn't exaggerated because of how it's clouded by how people are in shelters, people are being moved out of their homes. People don't have necessarily all the opportunities, but they make do with what they have. And homeless people generally don't try to bother other people because they feel embarrassed. They aren't really known about it. I've seen people that have hidden in corners and slept in corners. They don't like to be bothered. So the extent of homelessness isn't exaggerated.
Thank you.
1402.
516. Actually, I was late. I think you made the cut.
We're so good for the cutoff.
Hmm?
We're so good for the cutoff.
For the what?
The cutoff of 5:15.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I was late. There's enough doubt in my mind there. That was a comfortable.
I was focusing so hard on trying not to move hands. And then I feel like there's something in the palms later in it.
Yeah, that was most.
But then I noticed my hands start to kind of. That's how this happened.
That's where your nervousness went.
I mean, if you combine. We are not into the first.
Right. More faces.
Graded. I just said that it's clouded, so staging, and then I defined it just to give like
Right.
background.
Right. Yeah. Probably did that. Yeah, is that real?
That's a real thing.
I've never heard of that.
It was basically wild. And they just gave them like a free bus ticket. They stated like go to a different area. The area was going to help them, but they have to leave it behind.
Yeah, they just.
But there was a story of this one guy in Key West. He loved the area. He was like lived there for a long time. But then he got a one-way ticket out, and then he went to go back, and then they wouldn't accept him back there, and he just stopped being homeless.
That's wow. Amazing what lengths
San Francisco's really
will
known.
go to treat other human beings.
It's just it's making someone else's problem.
There's a South Park episode of that. I know. I know. All your citations are fees.
Mhm.
I'll just collect all that stuff at the end. Yeah, I'm gonna stick this with you. I'll collect all your stuff.
why only prisons keep the only way to solve overcrowding.
All right, what's your topic?
Building more prisons is not the only way to solve prison overcrowding.
All right. Audience, are you ready? Maddie, are you ready? And proceed.
Overcrowding in prisons has been an issue in the United States of America for many years. This especially rose in the mid-1900s, and it continues on today. As of July 1989, about 49,500 people were confined in federally run prisons designed to house 31,100. In other words, these prisons were operating at 59% over their official capacity, said Bureau Chisley in 1989. Now, as you can see, this isn't just a slight issue. These prisons are operating at over 50% of what they should be operating at. This means that they're both understaffed and unable to give proper treatment to those of our citizens who are behind bars for one reason or another. Today, in order to help you better understand the issue of prison overcrowding and how we can combat it, I'm going to give you a brief history of why we have overcrowding in the first place, some possible solutions, and why building more prisons isn't the only way to go. So first off, I have to throw this in there, baby boomers. So essentially, to understand this demographics in prisons, most people are between the ages 20 and 45 years old. So something that we've seen in recent years is actually, since we had a giant increase in the population with baby boomers, since they all had children, well, not all, but a lot of them had children, there's also just been an increase in the population in general, which therefore increases the percentage of how many people are occupying prisons. And we didn't really do much to combat this in advance. So that's why we're seeing so many overcrowding problems today. And since the presidency of Nixon, we've actually seen a big increase in the incarcerations of people due to the war on crime and the war on drugs, which means there have been more arrests made, which overall increases the percentage of people that are going to end up behind bars. Now, this was a huge issue, especially in like the 1960s, because you got to think of what's going on at the time. We've got the civil rights movement. There's a lot of violence in the United States, and drug usage was increasing, and just crime overall was at a higher rate than it had ever been before. So in the election of Nixon and Humphrey in 1968, there was actually a big push for how these presidents or presidential candidates were going to handle crime when they were in office, because people wanted to feel safe in their homes again. So the big reason Nixon won was because they thought he was going to be a lot harder on crime and criminals, and that has carried on throughout our presidencies today. And the big issue with why this hasn't been handled, especially at a national level, is because like regulating prison overcrowding is up to state officials and changing the legislature within their own states. And this is honestly hard to do, especially at a national level, but even at a state level. And so a lot of things that have happened is it has become very common to house the mentally ill inmates in solitary confinement, said the Vera Institute of Justice in 2019. And this is a little bit inhumane, and honestly, it's because there aren't many laws in place that set guidelines for how we're going to handle this issue. And so prisons themselves are forced to have to come up with alternative options that aren't necessarily suitable to all the inhabitants of prisons. Now, there are three main views for different ways to solve prison overcrowding. One of these is early release, but then harsher terms on parole. This is something that has been established in California since about 2011. And it's honestly worked fairly well. This isn't for your serious or violent crime offenders. This is for like minor drug offenses where they're serving time in jail for like between 3 to 10 years, like shorter term sentences, and they're able to just serve these outside of prison on parole, which then leaves more space in the prisons for those more dangerous criminals. Another thing is diversion programs. This is something that Texas and Arkansas have both used quite a bit, and it has been extremely effective. Texas has actually completely stopped building more prisons, and instead they use a lot of their drug offenders and they move them to drug treatment facilities. And they've actually seen a huge decrease in their overcrowding and also in recidivism, which is the tendency for someone who's committed a crime to continue to commit crimes. And a lot of this had to do with, like what Connor said, this 3 strikes law. we've heard about that before. So a lot of different things like that are used to try and combat how many people end up in prisons, but sometimes they contradict each other. And so it's a little hard to decide like what things are going to be beneficial or not, which then leads to a more obvious solution that people have considered, which is upping the capacity that prisons can hold. And so this means that they like put more beds, and honestly, the prisons just become more crowded without there actually being more space. They're just filling the space with more things to better equip those who have to stay there. So that is why a lot of people have decided to build more prisons, but in reality, this takes a long time. It isn't an effective, instant solution. It takes a lot of years. It takes a lot of taxpayers' dollars. And let's be honest, taxpayers don't really like having, when taxes are raised and they have to pay more. So if we can find more effective solutions, it's honestly going to be better for us as a society overall. And by pushing back the cycle of construction, these counties can save money, have fewer of their community members behind bars, and dedicate more resources to evidence-based practices that more effectively ensure community safety, said Matoya and others in 2018. And honestly, I agree with this. I think we need to focus more on rehabilitation and not just filling our prisons and overcrowding them more. There are a lot more viable options, and that is my stance.
5/15/98.
5/16/85.